Merry Christmas Eve. Happy holidays to everyone. Back in the day, it was actually very common to tell horror stories right before Christmas dropped on Christmas Eve. We are going to be talking about scary stories from Reddit, over the internet, urban legends, all of that good stuff. Grab some snacks, sit down, get some hot chocolate. Alright guys, this is the first story. This story is called A Spy Cam in My Christmas Tree Caught More Than Just Santa.
Last year, on Boxing Day, I found a really cool ornament in a clearance box. It had a built-in camera to record a unique perspective on your holiday celebrations. I grabbed the last one from the store's dusty shelf and brought it home for less than $10. I forgot about it until my wife, my two daughters, and I decorated the house earlier this month. I told my daughters about the camera and said we'd secretly catch Santa in the act. I had an old costume in the attic and intended to deliver some gifts in full view of the camera on Christmas night. My girls were overjoyed and went back and forth trying to find the best place to put the ornament on the tree. They had no idea Daddy repositioned it later so it could actually catch the living room and a good angle. We enjoyed Christmas Eve as a family, playing board games and eating way more junk food than there was room in our stomachs. Like we do every year, we let our daughters open one gift from Mommy and Daddy before going to bed. The girls, still riding their sugar high, could be heard giggling in their bedrooms from all the way upstairs. From time to time, my wife and I could hear one of them shush the other, claiming she had heard hooves on the roof. One of the kids also heard bells jingling. Eventually, they dozed off. My wife kissed me on the cheek and headed to bed while I turned off all of the lights. I retrieved the costume and tiptoed to the living room, getting ready for my big feature film debut. I did everything you would expect Santa to do. I ate most of the cookies, I drank the milk, I pet my large stomach and said ho ho ho. And I dropped a few presents by the fireplace, all in full view of the camera. A pretty good acting job, if I say so myself. On Christmas morning, the girls came running into our bedroom to wake us up. They excitedly insisted we watch the video before opening the presents. I transferred the footage to my laptop, forwarded to where Santa would show up, and pressed play. My girls squealed with delight and jumped in front of the screen, frantically waving at Santa while obscuring the video from my view. It brought me so much joy to see how happy the girls were. I was too lazy to stop the video, so it continued to play in the background while we unwrapped our gifts. I spotted a box I had not seen before. It was a small box and it was wrapped in a blue foil paper. I did not recognize it. My name was on it, but my wife seemed as surprised as I was to see it there. Noticing my confusion, my youngest daughter spoke. "Daddy, that's gotta be for Mr. Elf," she said, her voice cheerful and bright. I was ready to dismiss her elf comment as just another weird thing kids say. My wife was not so quick to ignore this. "Honey, what elf?" she asked. My daughter pointed to the laptop. By then, the video had ended, and all that was left on the screen was a preview of the first frame. "The one that Santa came with," she answered. Panic struck me like a bird in a jet propeller. I know my wife didn't dress up as an elf. I scanned the video, clicking forward and back until I saw what my daughter had seen. There was someone in the living room. He walked into the corner after I had turned the lights off. He stood there watching me parading around as Santa. The video went completely quiet after that. It was as though the camera failed to record a single sound. The strange tall man in an elf costume stood perfectly still for over an hour. After a while, he walked over to the plate of cookies and bit the head off of a gingerbread man. I glanced at the plate and saw his teeth mark on the decapitated cookie. The man then quietly approached the Christmas tree. I thought the audio wasn't working, but as he reached the tree, I began hearing his slow and steady breaths. He reached towards the ornament and the video stopped. In a terrified frenzy, I grabbed the blue box he had left behind. I ripped the bow off of it and tossed the frilly thing away. I frantically removed the wrapping paper, opened the box, and looked inside. There, on a bed of bubble wrap, was a battery I'd put in the camera the night before. My wife took the ornament and opened the back. The battery was missing. I don't know what scares me more, what the camera caught or what the elf might have done after he turned the camera off.
Yeah, no, I would lose it. I would start demolishing my house if I saw that elf on camera and my daughter was talking about that. That's insane. Alright guys, here's story number 2. This next story is called Every Christmas Eve We Throw a Holiday Party and No One is Allowed to Leave for 48 Hours.
1 hour till midnight, John shouted as he ran through the living room. I glanced towards the small closet in the hallway. The door had been removed and propped up against the opposite wall as usual, and the mistletoe had been sprung up in the center of the doorway. The closet was empty and there was no light coming from inside. I held on to my glass of water, nervous. I never drank at the annual holiday party. The things we were about to see were bad enough sober, and I couldn't even imagine what it would be like if I were drunk. I looked over at Mel, who was smoking a joint, as she did every year. I'm not sure how she managed to get through the events of the night, but maybe being high helped her process what she saw. John ran back through the living room, stopping to make sure all of the windows were locked and all of the curtains were shut. He walked over to the front door, rattling the doorknob and pulling on the door to make sure that it was locked. The rest of us, Ben, Alma, Mel, and I, sat around the living room in silence. Even though we had done this every year for the last 3 years, it wasn't something you could easily get used to. The horrors that we would witness tonight wouldn't be anything like the horrors from last year or the year before. We took over this ritual from our parents, who had passed it on to us when we turned 18. Ever since then, we made sure that every year on Christmas Eve, we gather at John's house to make sure that we keep all of the holiday horrors away from the rest of you. The drugs and the food are only here to distract us, although it hardly ever works. We all gather on the day before Christmas Eve, a few minutes before midnight, and we stay inside John's house until midnight on Christmas night. It doesn't always start at the same time, but never before 1 p.m. on Christmas Eve, so we always make sure that we are inside the house and that all the exits are locked tight before the fun starts. I use the word fun very loosely here. I set my glass of water down as Mel passed me by, letting us know she was going to pee before it all started. She came back fairly quickly and plopped back down on the couch sighing. Mel was always annoyed that we had to do this. She didn't seem as affected by it as the rest of us, and she would usually spend most of the month of December complaining about the holiday party. "John," Ben shouted suddenly, "it's starting." I looked back at the closet. Ben was right, it was starting, and standing in the threshold under the mistletoe was a creature whose top was half reindeer and whose bottom was half a nude human male. It stood there, looking towards us. Its head had a big hole where its left eye should have been, as if it had been shot there, and there was dried blood all over its face. Its left antler was broken in half, and I could see some bugs crawling around the wound in its face. "What the fuck is that?" Alma whispered. No one replied. We just stood there watching it as it watched us. It retreated back into the closet before it got down on all fours and charged towards us. I still flinched even though I knew it couldn't make it more than a few feet away from the closet. I remember asking my parents once why we had to make sure all the exits were locked, even though most of the monsters couldn't get more than a few feet away from the mistletoe. They didn't give me a direct answer, only that making sure that everything was locked guaranteed that nothing would get out. "Jesus Christ," Mel shouted. It continued to charge towards us, ramming into the invisible barriers each time. Then, just as it had randomly appeared, the creature randomly disappeared and there was a few minutes of empty silence. No one said a word, but we all watched as the next creature appeared. This one was a human, but there was something wrong with him as usual. The man had been flattened out to resemble the shape of a gingerbread man. He had large, rotting gumdrops that were meant to be gingerbread buttons sewed down his front. His mouth had been pulled back at the corners with some sort of metal hoops that pierced through his skin in order to give him a permanent smile. He waddled from side to side as he attempted to balance on his flattened feet. As he tried to walk out of the closet, his arms got stuck in the doorway and he ran into it over and over, slamming himself into it harder and harder each time, until there was a sickening crunching noise and his arms flopped backwards. He finally waddled through the doorway this time, and he made it out further than the first creature had and began waddling towards us. "Fuck this," Ben said, leaping behind the couch to take cover. I took a few steps back as the man continued to waddle towards us into the living room. Suddenly, a branch pierced through his chest from the back, and he was violently pulled back into the closet where he disappeared. That was immediately followed by dozens of branches that snaked their way around the floor of the house, climbing up the walls as they made their way around the house. The branches were covered in the sharpest pine needles I'd ever seen, with a few random broken ornaments hanging off of them. I jumped up onto the couch as the branches made their way into the living room, and everyone else followed my lead as we watched the branches weave in and out of the floorboards. Suddenly, Alma screamed and I turned towards her. Some of the branches had wrapped around the legs of the chair she was on, and she was being pulled towards the closet. John attempted to reach out for her as she was dragged past him, but the branches began to snake up and intertwine until they created a sort of protective dome around the chair, trapping Alma inside. She continued to yell as I tried to figure out a way to get her out of there without the branches getting to me, but it seemed impossible. It was like the branches had a mind of their own and were making sure that none of us could help Alma. We watched as she was dragged into the closet along with the chairs, before the branches finally retreated. "What was that? They've never taken any of us before," Ben said. No one replied as we continued to watch the closet. Suddenly, Alma leaped out and ran out, but was stopped a few feet away from the doorway. "What?" she shouted, panicked. "Let me out." John leapt off the coffee table and ran over, grabbing hold of Alma's hand and attempting to pull her away from the doorway, but he couldn't. "Don't leave me here, please, please help me," Alma sobbed. Ben ran over and tried to help John, but something was holding Alma back and stopping them from pulling her away. "Ow!" Alma shouted suddenly. I ran over as Mel followed. "What happened?" I asked. "I don't know. Did we pull too hard?" John asked Alma. "Ow!" Alma shouted again, louder this time. "Alma, what's wrong?" I asked. "It hurts," she shouted as she fell to her knees. We watched as she continued to shout in pain, and then we realized what was happening. Her skin was being peeled off in one large chunk. Her bicep had been exposed as the skin continued to peel off from the back to front, until everything, including her face, came off. Alma continued to scream the whole time, even after her skin was off. Then, her skin began crawling towards us as she screamed and cried in the background. and it started to make sense why John's parents had told us to find a remote area to host the parties at. We began to back away as her skin continued to crawl towards us. I soon realized that it was heading towards John specifically, and he backed into a wall as soon as it continued to snake towards him, climbing up his body. It was at this point that I realized that Alma had stopped screaming, and I turned just in time to see her limp body being dragged back into the closet. It looked like she was dead. I started to get anxious then. None of the things we had witnessed had ever affected us this much. Usually some of us would walk away with some scratches, but nothing this permanent. I took a deep breath as I tried to ignore my voice in my brain that was screaming at me to get out of the house as soon as possible. But I knew that I couldn't. I couldn't let all these things out into the world. I turned back to look at John as Alma's skin began wrapping itself around his torso until it tightened and formed a weird skin sweater around him. John started to gag, and I looked away as I felt the urge to vomit. John began freaking out, and I looked back to see him attempting to peel the skin sweater off his body. Every time he pulled part of it off, it began to bleed until his hands and legs were covered in blood. He started to cry, scratching at Alma's skin as he tried to desperately peel it off. It did come off eventually, and John kicked it aside as he ran into the kitchen. I heard the faucet open as he continued crying. Oh God. And then I turned around and heard the sound of Ben's voice to see small elves walking out of the closet. They were dressed in typical green outfits, but they were severely deformed, with different sized heads, arms, and legs. We watched as they all headed towards the pile of Alma's skin. They began to pick it up and tear off pieces of it with their teeth and ate it until it was all gone. Then they got on the floor and licked up all the blood before returning back to the closet. There's only 5 minutes left until midnight, Ben said, breaking the silence. Do you think it's over then? I asked. No, Mel replied. I looked over to see that she was pointing at the closet. I could hear footsteps coming from inside. Do you feel that? John asked. I turned, not noticing that he had come back from the kitchen. We stood still as I began to notice that the house was getting cold. It continued to drop temperature until my teeth were chattering. The footsteps continued even though nothing appeared. I rubbed my arms as I tried to warm up and began to notice a thin layer of ice appearing on every item in the house. For the next few minutes, the house continued to grow colder and colder until I was sure that we were going to die. I could feel my heartbeat slow down as my fingers turned blue. My eyes had started to burn from the cold and I could no longer move. Then, just when I had thought it was all over, it was gone. The house warmed up in the blink of an eye. Is it over? I asked. Yeah, it's midnight, Ben replied. Where's Alma? John asked. I carefully walked over to the closet, peering inside. It was empty. There was no sign of Alma anywhere. What the hell happened? I asked. I don't know, John replied. This has never happened before, Ben said. She's dead. There's nothing we can do about it, Mel replied. She began to gather her stuff as we watched as she threw open the front door and left, slamming the door shut behind her. I splashed cold water on my face as I tried to make sense of what had happened. I wonder why this time it had been different. What do we tell her parents? John asked. I don't know, I shrugged. I should get going too, Ben said suddenly. I could tell that he was about to cry, and I stepped out of his way as he left the house. I could feel tears welling up in my eyes, and I excused myself as I ran upstairs and shut the bathroom door behind me. As I racked my brain for reasons, I felt a sudden chill as I noticed it was abnormally cold in the bathroom. I turned around as I heard a car start and stood there staring at the open bathroom window. My heart began to hammer against my chest as my thoughts ran around a million times. I walked over to the window and glanced down just in time to see Alma's car backing out of the driveway. Confused, I stuck my head out the window and squinted as I tried to make out the driver. As the car turned out into the street, I got a direct view into the driver's seat and I saw a skinned, blistering red Alma drive off down the road. The horrors have been unleashed.
That was a really good story. Honestly, I could see that being a movie. I could definitely see it being like a good Christmas horror movie. This is the third and final Christmas story. It's also a holiday classic in Germany and Austria. This story is called Krampus Has Returned.
Each year on December 5th, people in my hometown are brutally murdered. The police are at a loss. Everyone in my town lives in fear, and some refuse to leave their homes. With each victim, a poetic story is left behind. Johann had a secret, and he'd take it to the grave. This man loved his neighbor's daughter and wished to keep her as his slave, but she was only 12, not yet halfway to his age. But Johann did not falter. As he built the child's cage, the night had come. It was time to claim his prize. He snuck into her bedroom, a glimmer in his eyes. But in the child's chamber, a young girl he did not take. Lurking in the shadows was Krampus, hissing like a snake. When Johann cried, the Christmas demon let out a laugh as he grabbed the evil man by his legs and pulled him in half. And now the child sleeps in peace, snuggled in her bed, for Johann's body, torn to bits, have kept all the maggots fed. Wilhelm was a grocer with all the town's supplies, but he was very greedy and made his prices rise. The poor could not afford it, and some began to starve, but Wilhelm only scoffed at them with plenty of meat to carve. He always made them beg for just the smallest bits of food. Their suffering made him laugh, and he brightened up his mood. Wilhelm sat alone, counting money by the fire, when he heard the footsteps, quite loud and very dire. When Krampus stood before him and shook his rusty chain, Wilhelm begged and pleaded, praying for no pain. Krampus stripped him naked and hung him from a spire. Then the town rejoiced, and they danced around his pyre. Summer was cold-hearted, despite her lovely name, a witch in nurse's clothing, treating the sick and lame. But for her patients she had no love, and prayed that they all stayed ill. For when they slipped away she smiled and tallied another kill. She wept with their families, pretending to be sad, yet when she went home at night she danced like she was mad. As Summer bathed and closed her eyes she began to dream, and Krampus crept into her room through a cloud of steam. The nurse did thrash as Krampus drowned her slow, and now her corpse is turning blue as the demon tossed her in the snow.
Alright, talking about the Krampus story, do you know how, horrible you have to be for the entire town to dance around your body? That's insane. I'm, imagining the other parts of the story, too, where, Krampus is, ripping the dude apart and, the maggots are eating him. Ugh. Merry Christmas Eve, everyone. Thank you guys for watching. Let me know what your favorite part of all these stories were in the comment section below. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.